Welcome, everybody, to this special webcast. I am Scott Costa, the publisher of TED Magazine. We appreciate you finding this. We want to let you know that we've got a great webcast here for you right now, but we also want to tell you that on this web screen that you're looking at right now, there is a PDF, and we do want you to print that out and follow along with the presentation with that PDF. It'll certainly help you follow the things that we're going to be doing today. Our presenter, we're really thrilled and proud to do this. Our presenter today is Dr. Albert Bates. Al's an old friend of NAED. He's spoken at numerous conventions on financial issues, and NAED and TED Magazine asked him to speak today on the financial challenges that we're facing today, obviously because of the coronavirus. So I'm going to let him take it away. Welcome, Al.
Great, Scott. Glad to be with you today to talk about improving profitability. I wish we had a more positive topic. I wish we could talk about how we're going to make even more money than we now are. But what we're going to discuss is how do we make the best of where we are given the situation we're in. The handout is entitled Getting to the Light at the End of the Tunnel. And before I jump in, let me tell you what I'm not going to do. I am not going to tell you how to survive and prosper in this environment. Nobody can do that. I've looked at a lot of webinars in the last 3 days and read a lot of articles, and they all say, here's the 5 things you should do. Here's the 2 things you should do. Those people are making it up as they go. I can't tell you what to do. What I'm going to try to do, and hopefully successfully, is give you some guidelines on how you should think about your business and come to the conclusion about what you should do. So I'm going to try to provide some structure. It's still going to be back that you've got to do it. With that said, let's look at exhibit number 1 and ask ourselves, what are we going to do for the next 45 minutes or so? And I'd like to do 4 things. Number 1, I want to review a financial appraisal of where you stand. I want to give you 2 key ratios that you need to look at. There are lots of ratios you could look at, but these are the 2 most important in understanding how are we going to move forward successfully. After we do that, I want to identify what I call the key mistakes from the past. I was around for 9/11. I was around for the Great Recession. And what I noticed is after 9/11, distributors made some mistakes. After the Great Recession, they made those same mistakes again. I'd like to avoid that this time if we can. Now, that doesn't mean people were stupid. It means that people are human. And the mistakes that we tend to make are things that just seem, gee, we ought to be doing this. I'd like to see if we can avoid that. After we do that, for about the last 15 minutes or so, I'd like to put together an action plan to say, what do we have to do to improve long-term financial performance? When we come out the back end of this crisis, what should we be doing to be more successful so that when the next crisis occurs, we are better prepared? And then at the very end, the last 2 minutes, I'm going to give you some free software. Please notice the word free to try to help you with planning if you could. And even though it's free, it's pretty darn good, but it's designed to help you be a little bit more successful. All right, with that said, let's jump into the very first one. What should we be looking at in trying to evaluate where we are? To do that, we need a company, and exhibit number 2 in your handout has a typical NAED member. I've rounded these numbers a little bit, so it's not exactly based on the PAR report, but it's real close to the PAR report. Typical company is about $400 million. You're big guys. It's got a gross margin down there of 22.5%. That's a little on the low side compared to other industrial construction sorts of industries, but it's decent. So we got a 22% gross margin, 22.5% gross margin, and we're doing okay so far. Down below that, I've got the expenses, and this is an important point for us to think about moving forward. If I look at the expenses, they are heavily payroll. They're about 2/3 payroll, including all the fringe benefits, and 1/3 everything that's not payroll. NAED members tend to be a little bit heavier on payroll than other lines of trade. That means as we start thinking about life, payroll rears its ugly head. We're not going to slash and burn, but we do need to make some assessments about where we are in our particular business. Finally, if we take the expenses and subtract them from the gross margin, I get a profit before taxes of 3.5%. And if you do me a favor, if you just jot that down in your handout, I think that'd be nice to do. What's important to me is that's a nice number. We're not starting at terrible situation. We're starting at pretty good. We've had 3 or 4 great years, and so we're starting with a position of strength as opposed to a position of weakness. And that's going to help us get through this situation a little bit better than we might otherwise do. Now, down below there, I have something else on exhibit number 2. I need to take those expenses, which are still $76 million, and break them into fixed and variable. This is essential for you to understand your business. And as I look at distributors in your industries and other industries, they don't have a good feel for this. Fixed expenses are basically expenses that only change when we take an action. If during the course of a downturn, we cut back on travel, we have lowered our fixed expenses. But they only change if we take an action. So as we're looking at maybe a little sales sluggishness, those expenses are going to kind of stay there. Variable expenses, in very sharp contrast, change automatically when sales go up or down. And what I'm going to do, and this is an estimate, but a pretty good one, is I'm going to make the variable expenses 4% of sales, and I'm going to make the fixed expenses $60 million. And as we go back and forth, raising sales, lowering sales, we're going to have fixed expenses stay 60 million, the variable expenses 4% of whatever sales are. Before I move forward, one important point. When I look at distributors who've actually done this analysis, they tend to overstate the variable expenses. And that creates a situation where when sales go down, they think they're going to get more relief than they actually do. We need to really be careful and understand exactly what those variable expenses are. All right. The other side of the issue is how much do we have invested? And Exhibit 3 has selected balance sheet items. Not going to look at all of them. I'm going to look at the 4 that are most important. We got cash at $10.8 million. You guys are lucky. You're sitting on a decent pile of cash. Again, given we had some good years in the last few years. You got accounts receivable of $50 million. That's a big hunk. And you're still into some contractors, so some of that may be a little tacky as we go forward. Inventory of $40 million. And then accounts payable of $25 million. And what tends to cause distributors to panic more than they should is, I owe $25 million, but I've only got $10.8 million in the bank. Well, you still got that $50 million of accounts receivable. Your concern is if things really go south, maybe that will not be collectible. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. All right, great. Let's look at, if we could now, in Exhibit 4, the 2, what I like to call survival ratios. Maybe I should have called it prospering ratios. But essentially what they are is ratios that we look at to say, somewhere on the panic to relax scale, there's a point where we are. How close to panic and how close to relax are they? And these 2 ratios help us. The first is the break-even point, which asks the question, how much of a sales decline can the firm manage without resorting to desperation measures? That is, if sales go down, we've got those variable expenses that go away. How much of those go away to help us not have to panic and lower the fixed expenses? That's an important ratio. And the second one is a ratio you've probably never looked at. I made it up last week, as it turns out. I'm calling it the collection sensitivity ratio. How much can collections lag before we begin to have a cash crisis? And I know we're all concerned about cash in this environment, and we should be, but I want to ask the question, how concerned should we be? What is the demeanor that we have out there at the present time? All right, let's look at those 2 ratios, starting with the break-even point on exhibit number 5. And exhibit number 5, I've entitled The Results When the Band Stops Playing. And I stole that line from Fortune magazine a long time ago. What happens when things begin to get tacky? And you need to know 3 things to calculate this ratio. You need to know your gross margin percentage, which everybody knows, but you also need to know your fixed expenses and your variable expenses. And I said earlier, maybe we don't understand those as well as we should. Now, I'm not going to focus on the formula. The formula is just a device to get a number. I want to know what the number is. But let me just briefly glance at the formula if I could. We're going to take our fixed expenses, $60 million. Back in the old days, when I first started doing consulting, we called that the nut, what we have to cover. And I'm going to subtract by my gross margin minus my variable expenses and come up with a number. And that number is already printed in your handout. It's a weird looking number, 324, 324, 324. So what it says is we're doing $400 million in revenue. If revenue falls to 324,000 and change, we would wipe out all the profit and be at break even. Okay, so we got a number. You should know this number. You need to go back, and even though the formula is probably dull, calculate this, and it has an implication. That implication is big time. in exhibit number 6. And what it says is what happened there. And what it says is if sales go from 400 million to 324, we'll wipe out all the profit. The real crucial number on the right-hand side. And what it says is the typical NAED member. Nobody's exactly typical, but using the PAR report, as typical as we can get, the typical firm could take about a 19% sales hit before it wipes out all its profit. That gives you some breathing room. Don't know if it gives you a lot of breathing room or a little breathing room, because I don't know what the future holds, but it's a decent number. I've written on the screen that I like a 20% safety factor. Prior to the Great Recession, I was arguing we only needed a 10% safety factor. That got wiped out. All my thinking changed after that. We need to be, if we can, close to 20%. And you're close. You're not exactly there, but you're in reasonable striking distance of that. And what it says as a result of that, the fixed expenses, unless you decide to cut them, and you can certainly decide to cut them, that's your decision out there, will be offset by the decline in the variable expenses and will end up basically at zero profit. Now, what I do not know is how long things are going to stay nasty. I'm kind of looking this on an annual basis. And so if we say, hey, we have a couple of bad months and things get better and we come out and we take about a 15% sales decline for the year, we'll still be okay. If things are really nasty, this is maybe what you got to be looking at for the next 2 months. But I don't want you to say, I look at March and April with this context. I want to look at the whole year. How are we stacking up? And we've got some breathing room. Everybody listening to this and everybody in NAED will have a different number, however. And I'll talk about how different those numbers are and the implication towards the end of our discussion. And so here we are, doing pretty good. No need to panic, but I want you to understand, what do you think about you could take a 20% hit? What does it mean to you in your particular business for your number? Well, the second ratio I want to look at is that collection sensitivity. To do that, I got to come back and look at a ratio you look at all the time and a ratio you've never looked at in your life. The ratio you've never looked at in your life is called collections per day. How much money comes in every day from credit sales? I'm assuming, it's a terrible assumption, but I'm making it, that all our sales are on credit. So in the top half of exhibit number 7, I'm saying that if all those sales are on credit, every day we get about $1,095,000 of cash coming in. That's what we get coming in every single day in our particular business. Great. Now the ratio you do look at is the one down below called the collection period. You may call it the DSO, days sales outstanding. And what it says is if we take our AR, which on exhibit number 2 were $50 million, and divide by $1,095,000 comes in every day, we collect in 45 days. So the only reason I put this up here is I need to have that first number, that $1,095,000. How much money comes in every day in our particular business? I want to use that number in exhibit number 8 to say, what does our cash situation look at? I call this, again, the collection sensitivity ratio. And what it says is we've got $10.8 million of cash on hand. Hopefully $1,095,000 comes in every day. Okay. But if it doesn't come in every day, how many days can we survive before we eat up the cash? And the answer is, the typical NAED member, right around 10 days. Okay. So we could go 9.9 days if nobody paid us anything, which I hope does not happen, around 10 days. Now, remember, our collection period was 45 days. So what we have is we could take about a 20% hit in our collection period and still survive. That, to me, is, again, a reasonable number. It's not perfect, but 20% is again, kind of my magic number for where we could be in our particular business. You need to calculate those two ratios for yourself and look at your situation and say, how bad is it going to get, or is it going to get bad at all, and make a decision. Those can drive you to say what's going to happen on the profit side, what's going to happen on the cash side. Those are the two key drivers, the two key ratios I want you to look at. They will give you an appraisal of where you are. At this point, I'd like to look at the second concept we were going to talk about out there, and that is identify the mistakes in the past that we ought to avoid. The number one mistake we make is on exhibit number 9. And this is not you making it in all candor. This is your idiot competitors making it. And what we tend to do whenever sales get soft is say, we got to cut our price to make it up with volume. You can't do it. Exhibit number 9 is an exhibit I have used with NAED for probably 20 years. I'm going to use it for year 21. So here it is. This is a graph that says, if we start cutting price along the horizontal axis, how much do we have to increase our unit sales along the vertical axis? And if you go, for example, out to maybe 5%, that says, gee, if we cut 5%, I got to do about 40% more volume, physical volume, to make it up. And what this exhibit says is with your structure, a tight gross margin, some reasonable variable expenses, and a nice 3.5% margin starting, you cannot make it up with volume. Now, this exhibit is assuming that's across the board on everything. And you may tell me, hey, we're only going to cut where we have to cut. And that's a reasonable expectation. You're only going to cut where you have to cut. But it still may be a little tackier than you think it is. So let's take this exhibit and keep it in the back of our mind. We cannot cut across the board because we cannot generate enough additional volume, particularly if sales are soft, for crying out loud. So what we'd like to ask ourselves is, can we be selective? And how selective can we be? And what does that mean for us? That's in exhibit number 10. And I entitled this, The Economics of Price Adjustments by Velocity Code. And what we're going to take is the velocity codes for your particular items, A, B, C, and D, which most of us have. And the A items generally are about 60% of our sales. The B items are 20%, the C's are 15%, the D's are 5%. The A items, I hate to use the word, but they're commodities. And so let's assume we're forced to cut 5%. So on the A items, I put -5. We have to cut 5%. What will we have to do to make up for that in our particular business? And it says you have to do all 3 of the following things. All 3. You got to raise the prices on the B items of 5%. Well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. You got to raise the prices on the C items 6.7%. That's a little easier. And you got to raise the items on the D items, those slow sellers, by 20%. It still tells me it is a very tough nut to offset price reductions of a magnitude of as big as 5%. I need to hold the line. And again, I know your absolutely stupid competitors are the ones who panic first and cut price. And if they're commodities, if they're in fact commodities, those A items, you're almost forced to retaliate, particularly in a down market. I just want you to be aware, and that's all this exhibit is doing, is creating awareness of how difficult it will be to offset that if we're forced to drive prices down by about 5% on those commodity type items that we have. All right. That's one of the big mistakes that we make. I do not want you to make that mistake. I want you to do everything in your power to hold the line on the pricing situation. But I know when things get nasty, things get nasty. The second mistake we tend to make is, I got to phrase this judiciously, getting tighter on accounts receivable than we should. Now, I am aware that we're in a situation where we're thinking a lot of our customers are not going to survive. I'm aware of that. And maybe we're going to be really beat up on accounts receivable with not the AR being too many days, the AR being net never. And we can't afford a net never. But I want you to understand what it means to be tighter on credit and the profit implication of that. So I want to do it at Exhibit 11, and there's a lot of numbers on here. I apologize. The first number is that collections per day number. Remember, it was about 1,095,000 cash coming in every day. And if we're collecting in 45.6 days, which we were, 1,095,000 times 45.6 is $50 million. That's what we have in accounts receivable. If we cut 5 days and still have the same amount coming in, that means we're still doing the same sales, times 40.6 days, we could lower the accounts receivable to 44,493,000. Or You could take $5.5 million out of accounts receivable and plug it into cash. That's a big hunk of additional cash. I'm aware of that. It's a great idea from a cash flow perspective, but what does it mean in terms of profitability? And I'm trying to weigh profit versus cash in this discussion. So let's look at the profit implication. You freed up $5.5 million of accounts receivable. There's something called a carrying cost. You're probably all familiar with the inventory carrying cost. There's also an accounts receivable carrying cost. It is interest, which these days is as close to zero as it can get. It is bad debts. It is the cost of hounding people. It is the cost of getting lawyers to go sue people that don't pay ever. I'm estimating it to be about 8%. And I think that may be a little high given the interest rate situation we're currently in. But assuming it's 8%, when you cut the AR by 5 days, you're going to be $440,000 more profitable than you were before. That's a nice number. We've done two things at the same time. We've put more cash in the business and we've increased our profit. Here's my concern on Exhibit 12. The tighter we get on credit, perhaps the less we will sell. And I want to make sure we're aware of the trade-off between collections and sales. And exhibit number 12 used an ugly formula. It's a break-even formula again, which I used before. And it's going to say, how much would sales have to fall to wipe out that $440,000 of profit we made? It's going to take, and I'll put the numbers on the screen so you can see it. It's going to take our fixed expenses, okay, which is $60 million. It's going to take our current profit that we had way back there on exhibit number 2, 14 million, minus the profit we just generated from accounts receivable, divided by the same numbers we had before. I'll give you the answer. Write this down. It is crucial to understand. At the very bottom of exhibit 12 on the right-hand side, minus 0.6%. What that says is the following. If you lower the AR by 5 days, if sales falls by 0.6%, it will wipe out all the profit you generated from doing that. It doesn't say what you should do. Nowhere in this session will I say what you should do. What I want you to be aware of is what is that profit versus cash flow trade-off. And the trade-off tends to be a little bit nasty. That losing sales kills profit in a hurry, as you already know. So you need to take that analysis in 11 and 12 and think about, what do I want to do in my particular business with regard to both the accounts receivable and the profit that we make? How do I begin to relate those two in my particular business? Great. There's one more thing that people do in a recession, and it is we say, we got too much inventory, let's stop buying. Well, Exhibit 13 says that's kind of a dumb idea. Exhibit 13, I could spend an hour on it, but I'm going to give you the shorthand version. I've taken all the items in our product line, and I've rated them from fastest selling to slowest selling on the horizontal axis. And I've looked at what is the implication of this, and what it says, to the surprise of nobody in the world. If you go to the 20% line, the 20% of the fastest selling SKUs will give you about 80% of your sales. Everybody knows that. What we're not so well aware of is that those items that give you 80% of your sales only eat up 60% of your inventory investment. And what that says is you're getting rapid turns on those items. Of course you are. That's where you drive the turnover up. As we go further to the right, more and more inventory in relationship to sales. In fact, on the right-hand side, I'm getting 40% of my sales from 60% of inventory. And when I get out way towards the right, I got a problem. A lot of inventory, not much sales. If you're going to cut the inventory, you got to say, I'm going to cut it on the slow selling stuff. That takes forever to cut your inventory. I know that. But I've seen too many companies say, let's stop buying. And as soon as you stop buying, you run out of stock on the A items on the left-hand side of this screen. I do not want you to do that. I know you've got cash flow challenges potentially coming up, but I've got to maintain the inventory. And I know why you need to maintain the inventory. It's on exhibit number 14, and it's entitled What the Customers Really Want. This is based on some research we did for a trade association on what did their customers want them to provide. And this particular research project went out and said, what new services do our customers want? And the customers came back and said, we don't want any new services. We want you to be better on fill rate than you currently are. That says we need to not cut the inventory. I want you to have depth of assortment. I want you to have speed of delivery, order accuracy, and then pricing. Those are in order of importance. And it was a cry in the dark that I want you to do better with regard to inventory. A question arises, what trade association did this research? And the answer is NAED. This is your customers telling you what they want. And they're not saying, I'd really like you to control your cash flow position, cut the inventory. I don't need service level. We need to maintain the inventory, even in a down market. And I wish I could have another way around that, but I do not, because I'm not that smart out there. We need to, if we could, hold the line on the inventory. All right, good. My third thing is, what are we going to do going out the back door to make sure we're successful in the future? What do we have to do to be successful going forward? And most of my suggestions focus on the sales side. It's going to be a sales recovery sort of world. It's going to be a world in which we need to do better with what we have. And I want to address that. And I want to give you some bad news in Exhibit 15. Exhibit 15 says, hey, what's wrong with this picture? And I have two ratios. The first ratio is sales per employee. This is the critical ratio that we look at to measure sales productivity, employee productivity. And if I look at that ratio between 2013, 2018, which are the numbers that are in your PAR report that I had access to, we improved our sales per employee 13.5%. That's not bad. You know, we're trucking along. We're using technology better. We're scheduling people better. We're doing all sorts of things that we're supposed to. So that's wonderful, except if I go down to the bottom of 15, during that same time period, payrolls percent of sales actually went up slightly. I'm going to call it a push. It's staying the same. It's actually technically up a little bit, but it's a push. And what that says is technology and doing better with sales per employee are not going to cut it. We need to do something better. Better is a strong word. We do something different. And I think we have three things that we need to do. The first one we're going to talk about is get control of the sales force. The second one is look at the order economics. And the third is review our customer set in greater detail than we're now looking at. Let's start on exhibit number 16. And exhibit number 16 says, where do the payroll dollars go? So I took your PAR report and looked at these four categories: officers, owners, sales force, operations, okay, that is the warehouse, the trucking, etc., and then everything else, the back office, those sorts of things. And I asked myself, what percent of sales go to those? And if you recall from the previous exhibit, in the PAR report, payrolls percent of sales is exactly 13%. Exactly 13%. For my little sample company, I had it slightly lower than that because I rounded some things, but this is the number in stone in the PAR report, 13%. So where could we cut? Well, let's first ask ourselves, what percent of payroll do we have? And the officers and salaries are 10.8% of payroll. The sales force, jot this number down, it's blank, 48.5% of your payroll. Operations 15.4%, all other 25.4%. Now, I would not suggest that we reduce owners and officers. I think that's not a really good idea, but let me tell you, the sales force jumps out at me in big time terms. And I'm going to get on the soapbox slightly. Sales, I believe, is the most difficult job on the face of the earth. I really think it is. It is also one for which most people are not qualified to do the job. And I fundamentally believe that we have people in the sales positions in our organizations who would be better off in accounting. Okay, so I just want to make sure that everybody you have in your business on the sales side is producing. If you've got somebody who's a weak hitter in the warehouse, you can live with it. It's not pleasant, but you can live with it. If you have somebody who's a weak hitter on the sales side, you are in fact losing money in that particular regard. They're killing your particular business, because they're eating expenses. They're not generating the revenue we should. I want you to be a little tighter. I don't want you to go out and fire the whole blooming sales force, but I want you to say, are we getting productivity from everybody that we should? Before we move on, let me come back and kind of reconnoiter a second on Exhibit 17 and talk about the relative impact on profit of the CPVs. And I've got 5 lines here. And what it's doing on every one of these lines is saying, we're currently sitting on the vertical axis at a 3.5% PBT. If we were to do 5% better, 10% better, 15 or 20% better on 5 things, what would happen to PBT? Now, I'm talking about PBT. I'm not talking about cash. Be aware of that. As I look at that graph, the lowest line, there's actually 2 lines there together. If you lower the inventory in AR, let me tell you, PBT doesn't go up much. Your cash goes up a lot. I'm aware of that. But your PBT does almost nothing. The blue line there, the next line up, is sales. The line above that is expenses, which says that, hey, cutting expenses is even more beneficial than raising sales and driving profit. Doesn't do jack for helping you with market share or long-term survival, but that's where it is. It's better than sales. And then finally, the top line says gross margin. I need you to put these together and say, can we get more sales without more expenses in our particular business? And can we maybe even drive a little bit more gross margin? I want you to be aware those are the drivers of our business going forward. There's no other drivers out there. Do not tell me we're going to lower the inventory and be more successful from a profit point of view. It ain't going to happen. And again, these are models based right off of your PAR report. Let me do one more thing. Everybody take a deep breath. Try not to hyperventilate because some of this news will be unpleasant. Exhibit number 18. I've broken the PAR report into 3 categories. Low profit, which I'm estimating. Typical, which is right out of your PAR report. And high profit, which is also right out of your PAR report. We talked about the middle ground. Okay, the typical. Look at the typical number in the middle. Current profit, 3.5%. If sales go down by 5%, profit as a percent of taxes will be 2.8. Or if sales go down by 18.9%, your PBT will be 0. Let's look at the good numbers first. The high profit, the bottom line, currently has a PBT of 6.5%. You can write home to mom about that. That's a number. If sales fall by 5%, the PBT is still 5.9. And these babies could take a 35% sales hit before they reach break even. Oh, I want to be high profit. I really do. And what it says is that PAR report isn't done for grins. It's telling you how you're going to be more successful in your particular business. Let's go to the low profit, which by definition is about 20% of the people in the NAED network. They currently have a bottom line, I'm estimating, because we don't know exactly, but I'm pretty close, about 1.5. If sales fall by 5%, their bottom line will be 0.6. If they have a 7.6% sales decline, they will break even. What this says is you need to be, when we come out of this negative situation, every day in every way saying the following: what am I going to do to make sure that we are a high profit NAED member? You got to be focused on that myopically. Now, as I've said, the last few years have been pretty good. 3.5% bottom line for a typical firm, it's nice. It makes one complacent. There's nothing like a terrible situation we're in now to kill complacency. And I hope coming out of this negative situation, we are not complacent. I want us to be focused on how do we become high profit distributors so that nothing that happens in the economy can make me have a fit about life. Well, I want to do 2 more things to do that. We talked about getting on top of the sales force. I also want to look at 2 really hot topics on Exhibit 19 and Exhibit 20. And these are hot topics because every consultant in the world is talking about them, so why shouldn't I? They really are hot, though. The first one in Exhibit 19 is order economics. And what this says is we need to start getting focused much more heavily on the structure of an average transaction. The average transaction in your particular business, according to the PAR report, is about $600. We need to change that. We need to change it in two fundamental ways: putting more lines on every order and increasing the average order line value. Let's look at this if we could, and there's a lot of numbers, but let's look at current versus potential. And what we're saying is we've got 701,754. What an ugly, stupid number of orders coming in. That's going to be the same as the potential. And here's what's really crucial about order economics. You do not have to go out and find new customers. You don't have to get any more orders coming in. If we could enhance the economics of the existing order, we can be a lot more profitable. Coming down to lines per order, there are currently 3 lines on every order. That's a PAR number. I'd like to raise it to 3.1. That's like nothing, but it's tough to do. Requires effort, requires enthusiasm, requires focus, also requires a system that allows you to know what that number is. By every salesperson, by every territory, by every customer, you got to have the data. If you don't know what it is, you have no chance of improving it. If we have 3 lines per order, I've now got in line 3, 2,105,000 lines ordered, or the potential column, 2,175,000. Okay, well, that's a difference. It's not a big difference, but it's important. Let's assume we're going to raise the fill rate because you're going to actually pay attention to what I say and raise it from 95 to 95.2. And now, interesting number. How many lines filled? 2 million lines filled versus 2,071,000. Here's what is important, both operationally and strategically. You have got 71,000 more lines that you are filling. That's important operationally because that's going to make your business better sales business. It is also crucial strategically because if you're getting 71,000 more lines, your competition's getting 71,000 fewer lines. And this is the way throughout distribution. We see companies beginning to push competitors to the wall without the competitors knowing they're being pushed. Order economics are crucial. So I need to make sure, am I getting all this? And on lines per order, it's do you want fries with that? Educating customers to know what you sell, doing all those things that we could. The fill rate is not being afraid to get rid of junk and reinvest into good items. Finally, the average order line. I'm going to throw caution to the wind as just, maybe we could raise this a little bit if we, maybe try to focus people on buying more of each quantity, or the way I always go out the door, raise the price. Easier for me to talk about that than it is for you to do it. I'm aware of that, but I need to get that average order line up. And if I could do it, my sales are not 400 million, they're 418. That's an increase of 4.6%. And you're saying that ain't much. And I'm going to tell you, hey, that's a pretty good number because your cost of operation barely went up. You have to go out and pick more lines. I'm aware of that. But you don't process any more orders. You have to take more things off a truck when you deliver them. I'm aware of that also. But there's not more orders on that truck. There's just more lines. It is not an expense-free, but it's a close to expense-free. And in particular, it's a close to payroll expense-free. And I said earlier, we are very heavy on the payroll side. We need to get that payroll under control, not by slashing and burning, but by changing order economics. This is organic sales growth. You get this and nobody does. No, you do. It's essential because you combine that with the market growing. You combine it with some inflation. You combine it with getting better market share. You got a real number. Excuse me, I got to cough out a cat, and I'm allergic to cats. Exhibit number 20, customer profitability. We also need to come back and say we've got some customers that we make a lot of money on. I'm calling them high profit on the left side. Some that we make pretty good profit on. Some we make some profit on, and some we make no profit at all. We lose money. This analysis has been done 1 million times. And about 20 years ago, I actually did this for NAED. be no way we'd find that report these days. We did. And what it says is about 15% of your customers give you the dollar equivalent of 100% of your profit. That's a number. The good profit customers give you another 15% of your customer base, but 35% of your profit. Those two together, about a third of your customers give you 135% of the dollar equivalent of your profit. The some profit folks give you about another 10%, and about a third of your customers are unprofitable, and they cost you about 45% of your overall dollar profit. Do not tell me this doesn't apply to your company. This has been done everywhere in distribution, and the same answer comes up all the time. Now, I am not suggesting you should go fire some customers. I am not a firing the customer guy. I am, however, suggesting that you need to go back and find those unprofitable customers and work with them and explain to them, not that they're costing you money because they may not care, but that they're costing themselves money by the way they order. And if you can get them to order less frequently, more on each order, if you can get them, and I know if you're selling to contractors, this is an oxymoron, if you can get them to plan ahead, you can change the nature of the business. You can be more profitable without impacting your payroll in any way. So I'd like you to do those things. Finally, let's talk about some free software that I'm going to provide to you in your particular business. It is really good software. It focuses on a lot of things. I've got a bunch of Excel files on my website that I'd like you to think about. But the number one I want you to think about is how you plan your business. Exhibit 21 on your screen shows the way that we typically plan the year. We start with sales. Of course you do. It's the top item on the income statement. We then figure out our gross margin. We calculate our expenses. And here's what bothers me. Profit ends up being whatever is left over after you do sales, margin, expenses. I want to change the sequence of planning. I want you to say that starting next year, the first thing we're going to do each year is figure out how much profit we're going to make. And this is the way a lot of high profit companies tend to work. I want to plan profit first. This is controversial. I'm aware of that because people tell me you can't plan profit until you know sales. Believe me, you can if you set some goals and if you have some software. Exhibit 22 says, I've got some software. It's on the website there, and it's just perf.com. That's Distribution Performance Project, mybusiness.com. You go to the Programs tab and go down to Hands-On Tools, and you'll see this stuff. There's about 8 or 9 Excel files there, all of which you can use in your business. The only one I'm focusing on is Profit First Planning, because that's what I want you to do more than anything else. When you download this, it will say, hey, this is password protected. You cannot open this till you ask Al for the password. If you send me an email and ask me, I will send you the password the same day usually. I will never, ever use your email to send you any stupid material on what a wonderful human being I am. I don't mark it that way. I never mark it that way. If you do this, however, you find some interesting things. Exhibit 23 is where I'd like to conclude, is this Excel file will walk you through your particular business. And it says, hey, the first thing you ought to do is plan your profit. And if you go down to the little box, this company's currently making $500,000 of profit, which is a terrible ROA of 5%. And they decided next year they can make $600,000. That'd be a 20% improvement, and their ROA would be 6%. And down here it says, hey, this is a fairly small change out down there. At the very bottom, the Excel file will talk back to you. It will say, hey, Profit Guru, which is me, says, you're not really pushing that a lot. You really ought to do better than that out there in the world. You really should. So I'd like you to go get that. There's some stuff to help you figure out that price cutting chart, which I showed you earlier. You can get that for your own individual company. There's a lot of stuff. I'd like you to use it and be more successful. Before we conclude, because I was supposed to do 45 minutes to an hour, and I'm right at 45 minutes, I wrote a great book called Breaking Down the Profit Barriers in Distribution. If each of you would order 50 copies, I would appreciate it. That would make me a lot more profitable in my own business as well. If you want to know more about profitability, it's a good book. If you know all you want to know, ignore it. It was a pleasure being with you. Let's get serious about our profit. Let's focus with a razor sharp edge to say we're going to look at those two ratios. We're going to figure out where we are on the panic to relax scale. We're going to implement the things we have to do to be successful. We're not going to make dumb mistakes like we have in the past, and we're going to plan for the future. And if we do that, we make as much money as you deserve to make because you're nice folks. Thank you much. I enjoyed being with you. I'll send it back to Scott.
Dr. Albates, thank you so much for doing this for us and using the NAED PAR research to really guide us toward the future. I really appreciate all you've done. We're going to keep in touch with you, and we will obviously continue to work with you to get through this particular period in our supply chain. So thanks so much for doing this for us. From me and from everybody at NAED, and certainly the people who are watching, we appreciate everything you've done. Thanks so much.